longtime associate and friend of mine, and he'll be talking about product management for startups based on his experience as a product manager in various companies and as an owner of at least one startup. So while we're doing the presentation, we'll have everybody on mute, and we'll ask you for this first presentation to channel all of your questions to the Zoom chat. You can either send them to me personally, or you can send them to everyone if you like. And we'll sort of do some consolidation and arrange to ask the questions to Mark at the right time. Also, just to note, our agenda here is tentative. It's very possible that we won't get through everything in this first presentation in this 1 hour, depending on how interactive it becomes. But we do have 2 other sessions planned where the agenda is more fluid, so we're ready to pivot if that's what's needed, and we will be basing any changes that we make to the agenda on your feedback and your questions at the end of this presentation. Okay, anyone have any questions? Again, put them in the chat box, and I'll hand it over to Mark.
Great, well, thanks Rick, and hello to all of you. Thanks for the opportunity to share this with you. As Rick mentioned, I've started a number of companies over the years, exited one startup last year, currently run another one that I've been running for a few years, which manufactures and sells medical devices. I've also worked with many startups over the years, both in consulting roles, in mentoring roles, advising roles. I worked for Techstars, so fairly grounded when it comes to the world of what it takes to take an idea and take it all the way through to something that customers get to feel and touch and play with. One of the things that I have observed through the years of working with startups is the varying degree that product management as a discipline may or may not be something that is important to startups. And some of the benefits in having a product management discipline is pretty huge. And I thought, it's a great opportunity to kind of walk through some examples. So for today's session, I was going to provide a little bit of an overview on, why product management, and then kind of talk through some of the tools that we have at our disposal throughout the life cycle. And then, to make it real world, I got a bunch of examples, based on some startups that I've worked on, which I was hoping to share with you. And I'm hoping that's, the bulk of the session. So just use the beginning just to try to, set some context, and then walk through some real world examples. And if there's anything you want to drill on in more detail, great. As Rick mentioned, we've got time set aside for Friday next Wednesday, where we can go deeper on some of these topics, or maybe, tackle some other topics. So before I move on, are there any questions? Great. So I guess the question is, why product management, or what is product management? And I guess one way to think about it is product management is about balancing in many ways these 3 things. One, it's trying to balance what the business goals and desires are with what customers want, and also balancing what it takes to get a product to market, both from a cost perspective and also from a time perspective. And from experience, I think the real art of product management is trying to, really balance across these three spheres. As fellow founders, I'm sure you've all, probably walked the life of each one of these and have worn hats depending on where things are at, skewing maybe more, say, on the business side when it comes to fundraising, more on the customer side when it comes to building an MVP, and and more on the say getting to market faster when it comes to maybe dealing with competition and so on. But the real art, I think, is is trying to find the balance across these three. And in many ways, that's what makes or breaks a company. So I guess I like to see the world as looking at tools that we could use to try to break the problem down from the early phase of trying to understand a market for a problem that you're going after, and formulate a plan, validate a plan with customers and so on. Iterate and improve on that plan, and hopefully go to market with a big launch and so on. So I thought it was useful to try to break these down into the respective categories and then talk through some of the tools that we have at our disposal, which I'm sure many of the tools you've used during the life cycle of the startups that you've worked on. So the idea here is just to kind of walk through some examples, and then and then show some real, tangible, concrete, real-world examples. So understanding a market, a bunch of tools at our disposal. Like I say, probably many that you've already used. Building a business plan is a great example, something that hopefully takes into consideration things like competitive analysis, market understanding, pricing, and so on. I've found competitive analysis to be an incredibly useful tool, especially if you have a direct competitor, or oftentimes we have multiple competitors, multiple ways of kind of sort of doing the same thing, a Venn diagram where if I stitch together these three things, maybe that ultimately is a product. Where I found competitive analysis to be extremely useful is in trying to look at the competitive landscape in terms of a matrix. I don't have an example to share today, but it's definitely something we can drill down on Friday. But the idea is kind of breaking out from a user perspective, customer perspective, the various different scenarios that you're going after. And then in columns alongside that is kind of scoring where, maybe some of the competitors are in that space, smiley faces up, frowny faces, some kind of number score, as a way to kind of both understand and keep yourself honest about the competitive landscape, but also as a way to kind of start thinking from a customer perspective, what some of the potential problems are that one might be going after. One of the tricks that I like to do is to actually break out, in terms of the product space that you're going after, is to break out multiple columns from a release perspective, where maybe you've got version 1 and you'll be, level 1 or level 2 competitive against a certain competitor. But maybe version 2 and version 3, you might be, say, out of a score of 5, you might be 4 or 5 from a competitive perspective, really effective at competing with folks. And I think that's a very interesting approach to take, because it also helps orient around go-to-market speak. So when it comes time to actually talking about and marketing a product, knowing who you're competing against and when you're going to be effectively competing against them is actually pretty helpful. Another area is around customer research and just understanding the market. And an area that I've found to be extremely useful is actually delving into the details of existing approaches. And I think Zach mentioned working with dealerships and trying to understand how they manage that workflow. I think that's a great example where, forget about even building a product, in just understanding all of those different scenarios and the various different touch points is a pretty awesome way in actually figuring out those user stories, personas, and then even prioritizing, costing, and so on before you even get to actually building something.
Hey, Mark?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention that I've sort of guided you based on what we typically do in the accelerator, that we're going to be concentrating on certain aspects here because we just won't have time to go into all of them, at least not today. So the ones that are in bold are the ones that we'll be looking at more closely, and the ones that aren't are ones that I've felt like people are fairly grounded in, based on the business, the Canvas and Lean Startup, and that we could probably spend less time on those. But if anybody feels like we're skipping over something, then let us know.
Thanks, Rick. So moving from understanding a market to formulating a plan, once again, I'm sure many of you have probably been through this before where, you know, trying to now peel back the onion of understanding, you know, from a user perspective, you know, scenarios, stories, and so on, breaking out personas, and then, you know, coming up with some type of prioritization and so on. You know, even building wireframes as an example. The example that I'm going to show you is, I'm going to show you a real-world wireframing example using PowerPoint of all things. I use an add-on to PowerPoint called Power Mockup. I think it's like $50 for the add-on. But the cool thing about it is it gives you all of the shapes for the various different devices. So if you're building a web app, it has all of the bootstrap shapes. So you don't have to worry about input boxes and buttons and drop-down selectors and things like that. All of those concepts are in the palette. The same goes for mobile, iPhone, Android, and whatnot. Hugely valuable. The interesting thing that I've also experienced in working with startups is that it's almost 10 out of 10. I've seen a trend where folks are very quick to build something, to build an MVP. And I often ask the question, how much wireframing have you done? And have you shared those wireframes with customers? Very rarely have I heard folks do that. But the interesting thing is using wireframing technology to kind of jot down an idea is on its own a very helpful exercise to kind of take something ambiguous and make it concrete. And it's also a great format to then be able to sit down with prospective customers and walk them through what a potential experience might be. The cool thing is the less technical the tool, which is why I like PowerPoint, the quicker it is to iterate, which means having an interactive discussion with the customer and the customer gives you feedback, you can right then and there make the change, show them the change, and then continue having a dialogue, which I find to be an incredibly useful tool to have in one's toolbox when one's thinking about something that one is building. Distinguishing between prototypes and wireframes, I'm also a big believer in writing code as late in the cycle as possible, because more often than not, writing code is actually a lot easier when you know what you're actually, the problem that you're actually trying to solve. And a lot of this work around formulating a plan is actually the hardest work, as I'm sure you've probably all experienced. A great example on prototyping is taking a somewhat more coarse-grained set of wireframes and actually implement them in a lot more fine-grained, some type of user interface from a prototyping tool perspective. And there's no shortage of prototyping tools out there. But I think the important thing that I'm trying to get across here is that oftentimes technology gets in the way of doing tasks like these, which are actually incredibly helpful. Some prototyping tools, there's one that I'm going to demonstrate on Friday, actually allow one to share a link where you can have customers interact with the prototype. So once again, no code, but the idea is to kind of get them, especially for visual experiences is to get them to interact with the user interface. And some of these prototyping tools are pretty cool in that they resize for different devices, you know, much like a real world application. In terms of validating the plan, so, you know, assuming, you know, good work around user stories, persona definition, prioritization, and so on, great opportunity to be able to get feedback. Just a quick story, I was working with a startup a couple of years ago that builds a desktop management as a service product. The idea is, you know, maybe you work in a company that has 10, 20, 100 employees, and IT wants to be able to control what software gets installed on your desktop, your laptop, your phone, and so on. If things are lost, to be able to wipe them and so on. This company was probably a year in, 20 plus people working on this product. And I got a call from the CEO where he said, we haven't shipped anything. He's really frustrated, huge monthly burn. Can I come in and have a look at what's going on? So I had a chat with the head of engineering, the head of product, and I asked to see user stories, asked to try to understand prioritization, competitive analysis, pricing, things like that. And as I'm sure you can imagine, there were a lot of holes in these various different pieces. So one of the first things that I did was get the team around a table, and we started to enumerate the list of user scenarios. And I'm going to walk you through a real world example of this. And then I asked, so there's 100 plus user scenarios. And then I asked everyone to prioritize, to give an internal view of the prioritization. And you may expect this, but what everyone came back with was everything was priority 1. In other words, it was the highest priority, which, as I'm sure you've all experienced, it's a little tricky when you're trying to sequence work. You can't do everything at once. So the question I asked folks was, what do you do first versus second? And they said, well, no, we have to do everything first. Well, it became pretty obvious why it had taken a year and nothing had been released. In the meantime, the marketing folks had drummed up huge interest out in the market. They had created conceptual videos and done a great job in kind of just creating buzz. And it also created a survey where folks could, you know, express interest, basically sign up for the upcoming beta. They had about 1,000 customers that had signed up. So clearly huge interest from a product perspective. So one of the things that I proposed was, now that we got the set of customer scenarios and we have an internal view on prioritization, let's create a survey and share it with these customers. Feedback was, we know what customers want, we don't have to ask customers feedback, blah, blah, blah. So I said, got nothing to lose. You have 1,000 people who have expressed some interest. I'll build the survey, we'll send it out to them. The survey was pretty meaty, about 50 questions, a lot of comment boxes, took about 20 minutes to complete. Everyone said, no one's going to respond to these surveys, too detailed. Well, turns out 70%, 700 people responded to these surveys. The interesting thing was when it came down to prioritization, it flipped everything on its head. At the time, Windows 10 was being released, and the development team had made a call where they said, every company that's going to want to use their product is going to want to use Windows 10. And as I'm sure we all know, corporates take time to be able to adopt new operating systems. 3 months, 6 months, probably even longer. And this was one of the questions that we had asked in the survey is, when do you think you're going to need support for Windows 10? And as expected, 6+ months. So there's a great example where even if you don't have a product yet, you're still kind of working through the plan. There are lots of creative ways to be able to validate the plan before even writing a single line of code. And those types of things I actually find to be incredibly useful and have seen great success when doing things like that. Rick, I think you're muted. You still there, Rick?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to, at this point, before we start to get into the examples, to, first of all, Becky asked the question here about when you share wireframes with potential customers and if that's part of the customer discovery or is it the sales process. So we could talk about that now or when you get to that example. But I also wanted to ask all the participants, now that you've heard some stories and some of the problems and seen the toolbox, think about the worst mistake that you have ever made in product management. And maybe a little bit later, we'll ask you to share those thoughts.
That's great.
Okay,
Thanks, Rick. I mean, the example that I just shared, you know, where you're 12 months in, haven't released anything, I think that is surprisingly more typical than not. So I'm sure we've all experienced that. The question is, why does that happen and how do we prevent that from happening, you know, in the future? And hopefully some of these tips and tricks are things that resonate and, you know, great to peel some of this back in more detail. Almost at the end of this, but, you know, some other, you know, topics are, you know, so you have a plan, you've implemented the plan, and now you want to try to get feedback. You know, a great area is around A/B testing. And this could be, once again, you know, no code type things where you're just A/B testing Google ad keywords or Facebook images to see how well certain things resonate with customers. I'm going to walk you through an actual A/B testing scenario in a short bit. Additionally, analytics. I'm surprised how few, especially from MVP, how few from version 1 solutions that are implemented include analytics on day 1. And I think this is also a great example. If you're going to share something with customers, you've got to be able to measure what they're doing with it. And in nowadays, you know, with things like Google Analytics and there's other competitive tools out there, it is not necessarily as rocket science as it was many years ago when it came to trying to implement analytics. Still not the most easiest thing to implement, but it's definitely gotten a lot simpler. And lastly, around go-to-market. Of course, through this life cycle, you know, even, you know, business plan, identifying who you're going after and some of the things that you're, you know, planning a message and position, especially some of the competitive analysis pieces we discussed are all, you know, keys to success. But one of the important things that I've also witnessed is how companies think about success metrics, whether that's, you know, KPIs or OKRs and so on. It doesn't really matter, but it's more if you're going to make a change, why are you making the change and what is the expected outcome that you're hoping to achieve? And that's an example that we're going to talk through in a bit more detail. So before I move on to the first example, are there any questions? Great. So this example that I'm sharing with you is real world. It's based on a startup that I worked on a short while back. As I mentioned, it's all built in PowerPoint. Took me about a day and a half to build. And a lot of it is the tweaking, the refining, and so on. And also conducting a bunch of competitive analysis, which I then use to kind of inform and influence some of the thinking. So from a simplistic perspective, the idea of this is you have a website and you want to be informed if there are any performance problems. If, say, your homepage goes down, or if, say, your product page takes time to load more than a certain threshold, you want to be notified about that. So the thinking was provide, you know, a very simplistic homepage where you can type in a URL that you would like monitored and then get some feedback on it. So I'm just going to walk through the flow. So I type in my website, I click go, I get presented with some visual map that shows me a bunch of data centers around the world. And here we get to see that a check is being done from Cape Town in South Africa to maybe where your website is hosted, which might be, say, on the East Coast of the US. You get back some information about this, response time, when it was last checked, and so on, and then get prompted to sign up. This image over here is not an image I created. I just Google Maps and so on, copy and pasted an image here. The idea is to be able to capture intent. So to capture the story and then to be able to get feedback on the story. Does it make sense? Does the flow work? Would you do anything different? How would you explain things and so on? So you'll notice over here, I haven't been asked to log in. And even here, we show that the user hasn't registered yet. So in this first scenario, we've identified one persona, and that's a non-registered user. In this next scenario, I've now signed up. The user interface changes where we now show that someone has logged in. We now add this dashboard menu that was previously hidden. And we now display a more granular view to allow a user to view real time versus the last day versus historical, and then also a drop down for various different endpoints, websites that they might want to monitor. So once again, to continue through the flow, I can demonstrate that there's a concept of expanding upon the various different websites. I can click on, I can go from map to graph. This is just a screenshot that I took from one of the competitors. I thought it was cool in terms of conveying the concept. The idea here wasn't to copy the competitor, but it was to use it as inspiration so that I could then sit with the designer and say, cool, what is this thing really showing? Well, it's showing me some graph of uptime, response time over a period of time. In this case, it's 24 hours. You know, maybe some status, is that or isn't that important? And then some historical uptime in this view. So being able to then dissect this and say, well, what makes sense for us to show, what doesn't make sense for us to show, you know, becomes part of that next conversation. You know, clicking on up here where it says rows, this is the historical view, showing up-down events where maybe you've, you know, had an issue with your website and then it was back up, some, you know, breakdown of how long it was down for and so on, and possibly with the ability to, you know, export information. Once again, none of this assumes where this data is coming from, but the idea is to capture an idea as quickly as possible so as to then, you know, get feedback on this. And then just to kind of continue through this, you know, there's an idea of being able to edit a monitor, some information about it. I could then, you know, choose different monitoring locations, pricing information, how, you know, how we might think about freemium versus premium versus add-ons. Clicking on this menu over here where we kind of drill into settings. So I know this is quick, but I hope the idea is that this is no code and it is surprisingly powerful in being able to capture those initial intentions with the goal of also being able to, you know, then get feedback from other folks. This scenario,
right. So Mark,
yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So again, Becky had asked, and you mentioned that you shared this with designers and as a basis for discussion about what's in, what's out, or, you know, what changed. But how about with customers, and what do you share with customers at this early stage?
Big time. I'm a huge believer is the more feedback, the better, as early as possible. Unless there are reasons to not do that, maybe there's something proprietary about what you're doing, but I think more often than not, that's very rare or unusual. For the majority of cases that I've worked on, the sooner you can share and the sooner you can get feedback, the better. One, it helps you articulate the problem space in a much more succinct manner. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. It also helps kind of talk through things like flow, talk through things like priorities, talk through things like personas. Here we've got, free versus or not registered versus registered, and so on. This exact set of wireframes that I shared with you, while they don't look super complete and so on, covered about 80% of the surface area for the MVP, that probably more than 80%, but a pretty significant chunk of the surface area. And like I say, it took a couple of days to build it, and then many, many days of back and forth with folks to get feedback and so on. And that, I think, is a hugely useful exercise. Like I say, in parallel, what I like to do is I like to then take something like this and then sit down with a designer and then evolve the design into something, a bit more real world. But the concepts remain the same, having, the ability to reflect that someone's logged in and the ability to log out, a menu, when I click settings, that there is some profile information. Of course, what's the best way to display it? Probably not like this. Probably I have, a bunch of sub menus over here, but this kind of, gets at the core concepts. And then, someone with good visual experience, is then able to help break this down. Another example is, you'll notice there's a map here. So what this implies is that, especially from an MVP perspective, the target device that this is going after would be desktop, browser. So that immediately forces you to then ask the question, well, what about mobile? Well, in this scenario, mobile is not accounted for because maps, obviously, high graphically rich environments like this don't really render well, at least in portrait. So now the question is, well, is that something we could display in landscape? Definitely a conversation. And those are the kinds, so by doing something like this, those are the kinds of extremely valuable conversations that come up, both when talking with customers and also when talking with developers. I hope that helps. And I hope that plants some useful seeds. So now the question is, cool, so I got some rudimentary set of wireframes. How do I evolve from these wireframes into something a little bit more concrete in terms of stories, customer scenarios, and so on? So this spreadsheet may not be the easiest to read, but this spreadsheet is an exhaustive list of customer scenarios that attempt to take the flow that we just went through and kind of dissect it into detail. Once again, zero code has been written. So as an example, just to recap, we had talked about a subscriber versus a non-subscriber. So those are two unique personas. So in good agile speak, from a user story perspective, the idea here is to talk about the who, subscriber versus non-subscriber, the what and the why, but not the how. Very important. And oftentimes, especially with technical founders, there's a temptation to focus on the how. But the how is less important if you can figure out what you're building and who you're building it for and why you're building it. So here's an example where, one of the first things is that as a non-subscriber, I can check the status of my website, using standard web protocols. If I scroll down further, you can kind of see another example where, as a subscriber, I can be alerted to a failed monitoring probe via text message. So the idea
Mark,
here, sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, Mark, I wonder if you could just, for a minute, back up and talk a little bit about what is a user story?
Sure. I mean, the idea behind a user story is to kind of capture something that a problem that a user is trying to solve in a way that is granular enough, but not too granular, and in a way that doesn't necessarily talk about implementation. So, and in Agile, there's many good examples on the framework of doing that. This is, me trying to implement that in a way that makes sense from the experience that I've had. So like I say, here, what we try to do is just enumerate, the full list of that experience from an end user perspective, and just breaking down, every little piece of capability. So, sure, I'm going to get alerted by email, but then what about text message? What about Slack? What about, so just, creating a list doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go after it, but it's a very important exercise to do. In the example that I shared with you, working with the desktop management as a service company, this was an exercise that I did with the entire group. We were like 10 or 15 people, 10 or 12 people around a table. And I just sat there in Excel and we just captured. And every scenario I said, who's the user? What is their problem that they're trying to solve? And why? And of course, everyone wanted to get into the implementation. This is how we would do it. And the feedback was, forget about the how, let's just talk about the problem that you're going after. I like doing something like this in Excel. And don't get me wrong, there's tons of tools that allow you to solve the same problem. But I find, especially in the early phase, tools often get in the way, too many bells and whistles for something as simple as, just trying to capture a set of scenarios that you're going after. So this is cool because, something like this, you can then quickly prioritize things. I also like to add some value around table stakes versus differentiation. And I very rarely see this, but it is profound when one uses something like this as part of an exercise that we're going through. The idea here is you may think that you have to add a whole bunch of features and that those features that you're going after are actually going to generate revenue for you, assuming you're building a paid product. But more often than not, there's actually a whole bunch of infrastructure that you have to provide. And that infrastructure is something that you probably can't even monetize. So the idea here in coming up with table stakes is really to kind of talk through the stuff that you just have to do versus the stuff that's going to differentiate you. And of course, we all want to build stuff that's going to differentiate us. But especially when we do the competitive matrix and when we kind of look, who we're competing against, it's very rare that we can just focus on differentiation. And more often than not, there is a tax that we have to pay, and the tax is, what I like to call table stakes. So the other thing here is around costing. So I like to do t-shirt size costing, and I have a simple definition here that says, and this is not necessarily about a developer's experience, this just says generally a small size costing equals roughly 1 developer day, medium equals 3 developer days, and so on. And the idea is just to take a pass at this. Maybe you know the developer that you sit down with, maybe you're technical, but the idea is to take an initial pass that says, yep, this will probably take a day, that'll take a day, this will probably take 3 days, and so on. And at the end, you now have a tally. You know that for priority 1, which is most likely your MVP, the end result of going after all of those things is going to equal X number of man hours. You can, add on a 50%, double it, whatever, but it's still a very useful gauge in kind of getting to the next phase of actually, figuring out how to fund something like this. And even if it's worth funding something like this, how you're going to monetize it and so on. You'll see over here, I have Jira tasks. So essentially what I then went and did was I imported all of these stories into Jira, created epics and so on, and then start creating tasks that then get allocated to developers, where we break these down into, you know, a little bit more bite-sized chunks that talk a bit more about, you know, implementation. And once again, if you're technical, then that's relatively straightforward to do. If you're not technical, then, you know, usually a lead or a developer, you know, would naturally then take each of these things and then kind of, you know, break them down into bite-sized chunks. The other interesting thing about doing an exercise like this, and not in a tool, it's not that I'm advocating to do this only in Excel, but especially for the first couple of times, it is a very easy way to kind of sit around a table with a bunch of folks and a projector and kind of start working through the statuses. Where are you at? Blocking issues, things like that. And over time, once this becomes a regular rhythm, you know, if it makes sense, then to look at a tool that could potentially help you here, or even just keep it in here. And then this becomes kind of like a dashboard, because I can filter on priority, where priority 1 might be the first release. And I can kind of just, you know, streamline how I'm presenting some of this information. Any questions before I move on? Alrighty. Cool, so we did wireframes, we did roadmap. I know this is probably flying through real quick. Next, let's talk about business model. Oh, I got it open. So this is a
Mark?
business model. Yeah, go ahead.
We do have one question here.
Go for it.
And it is, at what point do you switch over from doing user stories versus continuing to iterate the prototype, the no-code prototype? So when have you learned enough that you can, you know, move on?
It's a tricky question. I think what naturally happens, if you're doing this, if you're doing the wireframes and you're socializing them and you're building the user stories like we're showing, and then you're taking these user stories and kind of creating a survey where you're not sharing too much, but you're just sharing the right amount, and you're getting actionable, tangible feedback. I think if you're doing all those things, then what's probably happening is you are continuing to iterate on your, maybe now wireframes have evolved into no-code prototypes. But the idea is that this is something that's living and breathing. At least that's what I've seen work really effectively. Oftentimes, you know, talking about, you know, where people might get themselves tripped up, what I've seen, and this is a classic with that scenario where you're 12 months in, you're building, but you haven't released anything. And one of the questions that I asked is, so we talked about priority, everything was priority 1. And then we talked about status. And of course, because everything was priority 1, nothing was completed. So I think there's a great example where, as long as these things don't get forgotten, they don't start to attract dust, and there's something that you're using, you know, to kind of continue the communication and to continue to move things forward, then this thing is living and breathing. And like I say, maybe at some point, you know, the no-code prototype, you know, you're like, man, I've spoken to 100 people and I've gotten, you know, 500 responses to my survey. Damn, I'm pretty confident. This is like, in terms of V1, this is the thing we're going after. That's a phenomenal place to be in. But very few, at least startups that I've worked with, have truly like got that level of feedback and that level of confidence. Most of the time, and I think this is just human nature, you know, we think we know better, and we're afraid of getting feedback. And then that's, something that manifests in the thing that we release that some people like, some people don't like, and then it takes a lot longer to iterate and evolve and improve and so on. And the other thing that I've seen is that because as a result of that, an MVP moving into a like V1 or a V2, more often than not becomes throwaway. And that's something that I think is to avoid that, so that the thing that you're building first is the thing that's going to get you to the second and the third and the fourth version. That for me is hugely important. It means less time to market, it means less cost, and it means less stress for all, because you're kind of keeping in balance what the business goals are, what the customers want, and getting to market as quickly and effectively as possible. Hope that addresses that question. So I thought it also would be worthwhile to kind of walk through on this whirlwind tour business model. And I thought now is a logical time, because I think, and a lot of these things happen in parallel, they don't happen one after the other, but I think, doing wireframes and then kind of coming up with those user stories, doing competitive analysis while working on the business model are all natural things to happen at the same time. So this is a business model template that we use at Techstars. It's not rocket science, but the idea is to start capturing some of the intents, how much you think you're going to charge, the average churn that in terms of losing customers. If you have add-ons, so in the scenario that I walked you through, the idea is to have 14 locations that can monitor your website. So if you're target.ca versus target.co.uk, the UK folks want to monitor from the UK, the Canadian folks want to monitor from Canada. So this is like some of the concept behind the solution. So in those scenarios, those companies probably want to have some additional monitoring locations. So, here we kind of break down, this is just a swag set of hypotheses on how many people are going to add and roughly what percentage of people are going to add, how much you're going to spend on advertising. You'll see over here, we've got a breakdown of what we think we're going to get or have to pay for cost per clicks, Google versus Facebook. Conversions to subscribers from Google, Facebook, and so on. The margin we're going to make, a swag and infrastructure. I can talk, in detail on, well, how do you cost, how much this is going to take. Supporting the thing, and so on. So the idea here is not to walk through business model in detail. I'm sure you've got tons of experience in this on your own. But the idea is to kind of talk about how some of this information that we've kind of walked through influences and informs, what might be in a business model. So, for example, if we just talk about traffic, so now we've made some assumptions. We said we're going to spend X amount per month on acquiring users. So here we've said we're going to go live. Let's say, public launch is 8 months time. We'll do some, private launches, but the real public go-to-market, maybe will be around here where we're actually spending money on acquiring customers. Whereas before that, maybe we'll just do the, the private beta, get feedback and so on, so we can iron out any bugs and resolve any infrastructure issues, before spending money on advertising. So here you'll see.
Mark?
Yep, go for it.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but we've got about 10 minutes left of the official time, and I'm wondering whether this would be an opportune time to stop and have a discussion and see whether there are any questions. So I had posted a little missive there for everyone to think about the worst mistake that they have made in product management, as part of a startup. And so I'd like to give people 3 options. You can text me directly if you only like to share it with me. You can ask Dan to unmute you, and ask the question, audio, or just post it to the everyone text section for now, chat section. So who would like to go first? What about Dan?
You want me to go first? All right.
Yeah, you go first.
Also, just so everyone knows, I've turned on the settings so that if you do want to speak, you should be able to unmute yourselves now. So thank you so much for your patience. As this is my first time being tech guru on Zoom. I think in terms of the worst mistake I've made in product management is I'm a big believer. I don't know. I debate on this, and I love Mark's thoughts on it. Is I'm a big believer of polish the turd is the phrase I use, and so basically just get something crappy and scrappy up and going, and then polish it as feedback comes in. And so I guess really my question is just what's your thought about that in terms of like, how polished does it need to be before you deploy stuff? Because I feel like it really depends on the context of what you're working on. But I'm sure you've dealt with all the different startups. There's some that are really adamant about, pushing to production something and not worrying about some of the back end stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I'm a big believer in writing code as late as possible, and for many people that makes them very uncomfortable. But the reason for that is because you can do so much to validate the idea, to get feedback before it comes time to actually writing a single line of code. And even just like the sophistication of prototyping tools, what you can share with a customer actually might look like real world, fully clickable. You can complete fields, hit submit. It appears like stuff's being saved. So from an end user's perspective, you could actually share pretty complete experiences before having deployed anything. And the reason why I think that's so important is because more often than not, once you've made a technology decision, once you've chosen a stack or chosen a set of services that you're going to use, it becomes pretty hard to unwind from those things. And sure, everyone talks about, being able to move things across different cloud environments. It hardly ever happens. Sometimes, we don't know what language to pick when it comes to developing something. So maybe, we have a friend who knows something about a certain programming language, and they go and they build everything in this language. But it turns out now when it comes to scaling the thing, can't find any developers, or maybe the developers are too expensive. So there's a great example where the longer you take to actually write code, you might be able to kind of figure out some of the mechanics around that, especially when you think about how much it costs to build something. You can start getting quotes, since you've kind of, like we walked through with the prioritization, how much man hours you think this is going to take. And any developer could probably sit down with you and be like, yep, I think it will take a day, I think it will take 3 days. And then you can start shopping around for quotes, and then talking about the pros and cons of making certain technology investments. And that, I think, on its own is a pretty worthwhile thing to go through.
Mark?
Yep.
So Eve here shares an experience. Too open about sharing, and folks in another country have used my research to develop and sell their own program, which has become competition to me. So what's the balance there?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Well, the question is, it's in the chat, but it's about sharing too much, so that someone else picks it up and becomes competition.
Right. I think, you know, we all struggle with this, right? And I think that's where, you know, take the, you know, I call this effectively the roadmap, since it has the scenarios, the prioritization, and so on. But this isn't something you would share with customers, right? I would say this is an internal artifact. But there's a lot here that I think you can kind of massage, you know, into customer speak. And, you know, a great example is, how do you want, or how would you interact, you know, with the information that's being displayed? Would you interact with it on a map? Why would you interact with it on a map? Or would you just, you know, interact with it on a table, and so on? So I think, you know, depending on the space that you're in, I think there are ways to kind of work around, you know, sensitive topics, especially if you're worried about, you know, others going after it. The other thing to keep in mind is that anyone can come up with anything, right? So, you know, just because you've released something doesn't mean now you have a, you know, first mover advantage. Even though you do have something out, it could be someone else has, you know, done this many times before, and they can move faster, quicker, whatever, in having a similar solution, but maybe how they go to market is way more slick than you. So I think there's a fine, you know, balance between the fear of, you know, not sharing, and the benefits of actually sharing.
We have another comment here, TJ, who I think has bowed out already, saying, the biggest mistake I ever made, building exactly what a client wanted without fighting for customer discovery. Putting out a desktop app. And I think this speaks to sort of personal validation biases that we all have.
Totally.
We all want to be right about stuff, right?
Human
We want to be right when we trade our stocks. We don't want to take losses. I've seen companies that they will grind their companies to a halt in order to get a piece of software working, and it takes them years.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly.
So we're coming to a close. Are there other questions, or is there anyone else who would like to share an experience?
I was curious, you touched a little bit on incorporating analytics, and maybe this isn't the time, maybe we can follow up on this in a later time, but I'd love to understand a little bit more about how you see software companies incorporating analytics and what that looks like, if there's out-of-the-box tools to use, things like that. Because I'm really interested in that topic.
Sure, I'm happy to touch on it briefly now, and then, you know, if you're able to make Friday or next Wednesday, you know, we can, or offline, we can definitely drill. But I think from an analytics perspective, I mean, I think Google's done a pretty phenomenal job. I'm sure you know, probably use them. And I think there's a lot of like out-of-the-box tooling that they provided. One of the examples is being clear with your funnel. You know, so the funnel from, you know, someone clicking on a website, clicking on an ad, going to a website, to signing up, to doing something after sign up, to actually then buying, and maybe even buying add-ons after the fact. I think that whole life cycle, understanding, you know, how you acquire customers and how they move through that funnel is hugely important. And, you know, Google and others, Sentiment as an example, I think they all kind of have a way to solve this problem. I don't think it matters which tool that you use, but I think thinking through that funnel, and then coming up with a way to actually measure that using an analytics tool, you know, I've found to be very valuable.
So that's kind of on the sales side. Do you see any use for analytics, or do you encourage use of analytics like in app, right? Like in the sense of understanding how your customers are using an app, and is there tools that you'd recommend for something like that, where it's more on the product side than on the sales side.
Yeah, no, big time. I mean, just the entire flow, how a user, from when a user logs in to the screens that they're clicking on, where they're spending the most time, where they're exiting, seeing if there are hotspots and why people are exiting on certain screens. There's no shortage of third-party tools that, once again, you can use Google, but there's no shortage of third-party tools that provide, specialized analytics around that. I'm just saying, I don't think you need to be overly sophisticated, but I think it's very important to capture that information. And in terms of the funnel, yes and no sales, but at the end of the day, if you're trying to onboard a user and drive some type of adoption, forget about making money. There's still an entire life cycle on how you acquire customers, whether it's organic, whether it's paid, whether it's direct. Understanding that, how you acquire customers, what's the most effective, has nothing to do with sales, right?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Cool.
All
Okay.
right, everyone. Well, thank you all for attending. Please, you send any questions or ideas for additional topics, either to Dan or me. And then I'm going to try to get a feedback form out to the participants for this, so we can, in the spirit of continuous improvement, see what we can do better in future sessions. Dan, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone, especially thanks, Marks, virtual snaps, virtual claps from our desks, our muted desks. And I will send out an email about the next session, as well as I'll send a transcript over for those questions that didn't get a chance to get answered. This session has been recorded, and so I will send a link to that. So for the folks that were not able to make it, or if you want to pass it on to your team members. And yeah, thank you so much again. And, please stay home, stay safe, and stay engaged. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, guys. Hope that was worthwhile.